I hired a private detective. My wife had changed a lot in the last month, and our quarrels were getting louder and more ridiculous. What about her? As if she hadn't noticed her transformation. I had my own small business for 2 years. It required development and my considerable attention, so I did not particularly bother and hired a private detective. My detective wasn't cheap, but he was highly professional. He managed to wiretap her car and even her office at her office 2 days later. And I listened to conversations between her and some guy. The guy, by the way, was a colleague of hers. It was obvious from the conversation that they had already had sex several times near work and even in the workplace. And now her lover really wanted to do it right in bed. They decided to do it at the hotel. Friday night, she told me she was going out with her girlfriends on Saturday. I already knew the guy was married too. I quickly contacted his wife. We met up. I told her what I knew and told her, if she wanted proof, she should come with me Saturday night. So we followed my wife, parked in the rental car outside the bar. Didn't have to wait long. My wife gets out, followed by her lover. He was already waiting for her at the bar. When we arrived, his wife was already crying. I tell her to be mad, not to cry. Then I noticed them heading toward my wife's car, which, by the way, is the one I'd bought her. The lover gets behind the wheel. They arrive at an inexpensive hotel, not far from the airport. I suggested that the lover's wife wait a while so they could get undressed in time. Then our trap would definitely work. 5 minutes later, I knock on the door and yell, "Open up, it's the guards." The lover comes to the door and opens it, holding only a towel over his groin. I say, "Hi, I'm the husband," and I punch him in the face. He goes down. Then I take my wife's clothes and I drag him out of the room, actually take him outside lover and throw him in a snowdrift. It was winter, the month of January. His wife gets hysterical, hitting and kicking him. I go into the room again. My wife is sitting on the bed. She's shaking, mumbling, "You shouldn't have known." I got even angrier at these words. I also drag her out of the room and drag her to the parking lot. I record her on camera. She trembles and admits to everything she's done. I tell her no one will ever forgive her again. I quickly dial her dad's cell phone number. She screams, "No, no, no." After explaining herself to her father simply says that she disgusts him and hangs up. She lets out screams and moans. I tell her to get dressed and give her her clothes. She is trembling and shaking. I call a cab, put her in the car, and send her to her own sister's house. I got into her car myself, as if it were my own, which I had given her. And her lover and his wife drove away in some rented car. Then, on Monday, I call her boss. After I told him about the actions of his 2 employees, and I told him that their continued presence in his company would force me to sue him, since I have good connections in the bar and the courts. Nonsense, of course, but it worked. He fired them both. Then he packed up his wife's things and took her to her sister's house. It took her 2 more days before the shock passed. She calls me, and I refuse to talk to her. This goes on for a few weeks or so. Then her sister calls and said she's lost her mind, has stopped talking to everyone. I advised her sister to call her medics. My wife ended up under observation at the psychiatric hospital. I got a call from the hospital, made a reluctant appointment, and was told before me that she had fully realized what she had done. And what I did shocked her to the point of complete insanity in the truest sense of the word. Her psychiatrist said she was having a serious nervous breakdown from her experiences, including the crushing humiliation I caused when I made her confess while standing in a public parking lot, half naked. The psychiatrist said it was extreme and led in part to a split in her personality. But things should normalize. I noted that she treated me like trash before I caught her, and her personality was not as good as she presented herself to be. As I was leaving, I was told I would call back the next week. The next week, our meeting took place. She looked dejected and like a shadow of a former woman. My wife used to be a figure skater with big shapes, but she had lost at least 50 pounds in a few weeks. She said she was trying to keep me from finding out about the affair and that she cheated because I was working too hard. I called bullshit on that. Reminded her of her own words from when she was complaining about not having enough money, so I went into business to make a living for us. I told her she kept lying. I can't be with you. I want a divorce. Her doctor almost threw me out of the room. I yelled at him, and he yelled at me. And all of a sudden, she says, Okay. Yes, I was selfish. I wanted to feel a romance, to experience the thrill, and to know what cheating was like. I suggested she think about what it was all about. Now the affair is long in the past. Your parents resent you. Your job is lost. It's going to take some serious effort to make it right, and certainly a lot of it. A lot of the time she asked not to leave her. Said she didn't know what she was going to do without me, and I kept quiet. I was still in touch with my wife and her lover. They were still living under the same roof. I asked to see her and offered to have wine together. She told me she was a married woman. I told her I was technically a married man too, and the same circumstances didn't prevent our spouses from having fun. So after that, why should anything prevent us from doing the same thing? So we met. After a trivial conversation, I leaned in and said jokingly that it would probably be good for them if we became lovers too. I expected a polite rebuff, but to my surprise she smiled and said, Please don't take me to that lousy hotel. We booked a very nice room and spent the next 3 days getting to know each other. And that went on for about 2 months. While I was thinking about what to do next, to be honest, the anger had subsided, and I thought about leaving everything as it was. But something kept bugging me, and I decided to get a divorce after all. And now 2 years have passed, and I am grateful to fate for this incident. Because it was only now that I felt what real life is like, and I wish you the same. That's the story of the hero of our story. Write your opinion in the comments, and we'll move on to the second story. Second story. Perhaps someone has experienced similar situations as I have. My story is quite simple, and at the same time full of unexpected events and climaxes. So my name is Stanislav, and I am 37 years old. I am quite successful in my field, running my own small business. I live in a small country house and do not deny myself anything. But this is now. And it all started with the fact that first I had to go the way of total meanness and betrayal. So, I'm 20 years old kid came to a strange city and was completely alone. Except that sometimes my parents helped me. I went to college by correspondence, and in order to rent a room, eat something, pay for my studies, and buy some clothes, I had to work very hard. I clearly decided that no matter what it cost me, I must achieve at least some results. After a long time, I have a successful career, and in the next couple of years, I was planning to buy a long-awaited apartment. I was pretty fed up with renting an apartment. I was very happy and proud of myself. Emotions were brimming over the edge. It seemed to me that life had just begun, and now everything would be fine. I dreamed about my beautiful wife, my children, and my own comfortable home. And at this happy moment for me, I just met my future wife, Maria, under very funny circumstances. On another lunch break, I came to my favorite coffee shop, where I was served by a new, pretty waitress. She was a plain, ordinary girl, obviously from the provinces. Judging by her manner and speech, I knew it at once. Something flashed between us at the time. Her eyes literally drove me crazy after she took my order and after a while brought my dish. On the way to my table, she stumbles and her tray with my lunch flies out of her hands. She starts frantically picking up the broken dishes. I mechanically rush over to help her. "Please forgive me, I'm so clumsy," she said in a half whisper. "It was no big deal." "Don't worry about it," I replied. "Now I'm definitely going to get fired," the waitress muttered, barely holding back tears. At that moment, the administrator of the cafe ran up and started yelling at her employee. I began to defend her and say that it was me who had accidentally pushed her. But in my defense, the administrator replied that she saw perfectly well that it was she who dropped the tray and eventually fired her. And ever since then, without going into detail about what happened after she was fired, we got married and started living together. And things got great. I finally almost saved up for an apartment, made my wife happy with the news, and we started planning children, while I continued to work and pick up future dwellings. And this case, by the way, is not easy, I must say. Another piece of good news happened. Maria got pregnant. I was delighted when I learned about it and carried his wife in his arms all pregnancy. But all at once came to an end when I learned a terrible truth that almost made my eyes black. On that ominous day, I decided to give my wife a little surprise. At lunchtime, I came home with a bouquet of flowers and sweets. I went into the apartment. My wife was in the shower. I put the flowers in a vase, put the goodies in the fridge, and went into the room. I took my laptop to surf the internet, and it was already on. There I saw my wife's page on one of the social networks and an open dialogue with her best friend. And what I read there made me pale with horror and turned my whole life upside down. In that correspondence, my spouse openly calls me, to put it mildly, a loser from whom she will soon take away half of her real estate. And they were also jokingly discussing the fact that she is not pregnant by me. And as soon as I buy an apartment, she finally that will divorce and live a full life in the city to the envy of his relatives. I broke into a cold sweat and my heart raced. I wanted to scream from the pain, but at that moment, the water in the bathroom went silent. I quickly turned off my laptop and ran out of the apartment. I sat down in a nearby park, opened a bottle of hard liquor, called the Chief, got off work, and began to think about what to do next. And then it occurred to me, as I thought at the time, the only logical way to begin to solve this problem at the root. The only thing that calmed me down at the time was that I had not yet bought the apartment, but I was already going to meet and sign contracts because I had found a very suitable option. And I immediately came up with what I thought was an ingenious plan of revenge. A couple of months later came the day X. I have to say right away that all this time I pretended to know nothing and continued to play, as my wife put it in her correspondence, the knave loser. At one point I called her and told her that I had bought the apartment and signed all the contracts and that she could come right now and see our new little nest. In 15 minutes a cab would come for her. My wife was overjoyed, as evidenced by her enthusiastic shouting into my phone. After the appointed time, my wife got into a cab and drove to the appointed place. When she got out, she was pretty surprised and didn't understand what was going on, because the cab driver took her not to the doorway of her new panel house, but to the train station. After which I texted her, "My dear wife, I hasten to please you with the news that I changed my mind about buying an apartment and decided to buy myself a house." Why myself? Because we are getting a divorce. Half of the real estate from the knave loser will not be taken away, because after your plans, I, with the best lawyer in town, has drawn up all the papers on the parents. I wish you all the best for you and your future child. I think you have already guessed that if anything happens, I will have no trouble getting a DNA test. Good luck, sweetheart, finding not a knave guy in love to hang on to in the city, but a lot of brains to hang on to in life. And since then, we divorced, and I never saw her again. I do not strive to build a serious relationship. I live for my own pleasure. I communicate with different women, if you know what I mean, and do not deny myself anything. Found a hobby, which has grown into a lifelong business, because it's certainly not a child from a stranger's uncle will give birth to you. The final story of the day is the most interesting. An unfaithful wife got her lover pregnant and wanted to give the baby to her husband. You will be shocked when you find out how it all ended. Be sure to watch till the end. Enjoy watching it. There is no such thing as a woman who is faithful to the end. With very few exceptions, Every man knows this. Only one worries, the other makes peace, and the third tries his best to ignore it. I lived with my wife for 40 years. We got married when I was 20 years old, and she was 19. Things happened, and fought, and made up. But I was sure that in all that time, we never once betrayed each other. Nevertheless, wherever fate threw me, she was always there for me. We had 2 beautiful children, a son John and a daughter Catherine. Now they are adults, both with families and children of their own. I was sure we had a peaceful old age ahead of us, surrounded by our beloved grandchildren. I am a doctor. I served 25 years in the Army, reached the rank of colonel in medical service, and it has been 10 years since I retired. To this day, I continue to work in a private clinic. To tell the truth, I do not often hold a scalpel in my hands. My wife also still works in an advertising firm. She is a designer by training. We have no problems with finances, and we just worked for our own pleasure. I've been to a lot of places during my service. I was in Africa, almost a year in Mongolia, Vietnam, but I hardly ever saw those countries. The job of a doctor is almost round the clock. But every time I came home, I knew my loving wife and children were waiting for me. At least I thought so. Alas, as it turned out, that was just wishful thinking. Despite my age, my wife managed to maintain her natural beauty. She always took care of herself, which allowed her to keep her girlish figure and face without a single wrinkle. When we walked side by side, she was mistaken for my young mistress. The contrast was too stark. A young blonde and a gray-haired, mature man. A major with a young mistress. My wife was very amused by this contrast, and it flattered me too. But, as it turned out, I was having fun for nothing. It all happened one rainy November evening. Have you ever noticed that the events that change our lives for the worst happen on rainy autumn evenings? It's as if dying nature is trying to drag us down with it. It was late fall. I was sitting at the kitchen table going through my papers looking for my medical records. I was due for a checkup at the health center on Monday, and I needed to find my immunization records. My wife wasn't home. She had gone into town in the afternoon to buy groceries and cook Sunday dinner for us. I went through my old papers for a long time and suddenly found something that really shocked me. It was an excerpt from my wife's book. It dated from the period when I was on a long business trip and hadn't been home for a year. Just 4 years after the birth of my daughter's discharge, it was about my wife's pregnancy and premature birth. Tests and ultrasound results. It turns out that she had a premature 6-month-old baby at this time. After 3 days, he died. Next came the tests on her and the baby. Blood type, rhesus factor, and so on. So the baby was R negative and blood type 3. I felt like at least a closet had collapsed on me. There was no way I could be the baby's father. Nastia and I are blood type O and R positive. So our baby together couldn't have those blood types. Only type A and rhesus positive. And finally, the baby couldn't have originally been mine because I just wasn't in the country at the time. I stared blankly at the discharge form for a long time and had no way to piece together the thoughts that had escaped. My wife was unfaithful to me. While I was away from home, she managed to get pregnant and almost had a baby. But by whom? Until half an hour ago, I had been sure that I had a solid family, a loving wife, and an impeccable future. Now there was only ruin behind me. Finally, I managed to pull myself together. I carefully put the certificates back where they belonged, and I hid the statement I had found. The most important thing is to calm down. The fact that Nastia was cheating is a documented fact. Frankly, I had a desire to have a showdown immediately after the return of his wife. But I wanted to sort everything out first. The kids were all clear here. Both John and Catherine were blood type O yes. And so it was obvious that they were mine. They both looked like me young. I had no doubts. I was their father. But the thought didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't understand why she did this to me. We had married for love, and I had been courting her for almost a year. Other women did not exist for me, although I had an attractive appearance and was not deprived of the attention of the opposite sex. But for me, all my life, there was only one woman. During our life together, I tried to surround my wife with care and attention. Sometimes it seemed to me that I had no other single life. My wife was everything to me and more. I went out to the balcony for a breath of fresh air. When I looked down, in the light of a dimly lit street lamp, I saw a car pull up outside our doorway. After a while, my wife jumped out of the car and a man followed her. He opened the back door and took out some packages. My wife gave him a quick peck on the cheek, took the bags, and went into the driveway. The man flopped down in the driver's seat, and the car slowly drove out of the yard. The farther away, the merrier. The front door lock clicked. My wife's voice sounded unexpectedly loud, and I realized that I couldn't stand it and started to figure things out right away. She kissed me on the cheek, and I heard the fresh smell of alcohol. I tried my best to speak calmly. She looked at me with some kind of unfamiliar look. To occupy myself and calm myself, I got up and got a bottle of whiskey out of the cabinet. My wife looked at me frightened. It took a great effort to keep my composure and not turn to shouting. I poured myself a whiskey and said, "Sit down. I have some questions for you." I pulled the ill-fated transcript from under the table. "Explain what it is." I placed the document in front of my wife. She carefully turned a few pages and quickly jerked her hand away. She looked up at me with eyes that began to fill with tears. She was silent for a while, and then suddenly she said in a surprisingly calm voice, "It had to happen sometime, and maybe it's a good thing it happened now." In an even, calm voice, she told me that in my absence, as she emphasized, a very long absence, she had met a young man whom she had fallen in love with. He was 11 years younger. She couldn't help herself. At first she ran to him for a date, and then she took the kids to her mother's house, and he moved into our apartment with her. They started living like husband and wife, and from the ethereal love sessions, she got pregnant and he proposed to her. To her, a married woman, the mother of my 2 children. She even secretly hoped that I wouldn't come back at all, and then everything would work itself out. They would get married and be together, but it didn't work out. The baby was born premature and died 3 days later. She burst into tears at this point. My understanding was that she did not care about the remaining children. After the baby died, the relationship between them cooled, and she said they became estranged from each other. Then a young woman appeared on the horizon, and her lover finally left her, in pursuit of new adventures. When I returned, she met me as if nothing had happened, and all the years that followed she diligently played the role of loving and caring wife. I was shocked. To be honest, for a while I lost the ability to think and speak at all. I stared at the wall in silence, and not a single thought crossed my mind. I just stared blankly at one point. But that wasn't all. 6 months ago, her heartfelt friend showed up in our town. Passion flared with renewed vigor. Turns out she had loved him all these years, and my wife fell into his arms. Anyway, they have been dating all this time, and she wants to start a new life in which there is no place for me. She lived with me for 40 years, gave me her best years. And now that the kids are grown, she wants a fresh start with a person she loves. Saying all this, she knew full well that with every word she said, she was just killing me. For a second, she reminded me of an executioner, indifferently doing his job. For so many years she'd been trying to trick me. If I had not found the statement, I probably would not have guessed anything further. Without saying a word, I got dressed, threw some things in my bag, and went out. Autumn was waiting for me outside. I breathed in the damp air with my chest full. I threw my bag on my shoulder and slowly wandered down the sidewalk covered with yellow leaves. I felt like smoking. I gave up smoking 20 years ago at the request of my wife. She was very concerned about my health, and it was quite late. The city was trying to forget itself in an anxious sleep. The windows of the houses were barely lit, and only the streetlights came down with a dim glow. I walked slowly past the black houses, trying not to slip on the wet fallen leaves. "Man, do you have a smoke?" I turned around and fell into darkness. Bright light burst into my eyes. "Well, finally," a man's voice said from very close by. I turned my head with difficulty. "Welcome back." My boss, not hiding his joy, looked at me. "Aya." The words were hard for me to say. "Yes, you're in our clinic. Tonight you were taken to the emergency room with a brain injury. We took you in and operated on you right away. The surgery was successful, and you are back with us. Your children and your wife we informed. The latest events made my heart clench again. My wife. I no longer had a wife. 2 weeks later, I was discharged. My ex came to see me twice, but I refused to see her. At first, I rented a small apartment not far from the clinic where I worked, and began to get used to single life. The breakup with his wife had a twofold effect on me. On the one hand, of course, the pain of betrayal, and on the other hand, some still unclear prospects. Then there was a divorce, and I was left not only without a wife, but without my home. The children took a neutral position, but it was clear that they were more on their mother's side. I began to operate again. In my work, I tried to numb the pain of my soul, and I succeeded. About 2 months later, an old friend called me and asked to meet. "Remember a few years ago, I borrowed a large sum from you?" He started the conversation. I remembered it. 3 years ago, a comrade had borrowed a rather large sum of money from me. He was having serious problems with his business and asking for help. I had just sold my mother's apartment at the time, and I had the money. When I gave it to my friend, I did not specify a deadline for repayment, realizing that the friend simply could not pay the money back immediately. "Thanks for helping me out back then. I invested your money in the business, and as of today, it's paying good dividends." He held out a bank card to me. "This is my debt with interest. It's 5 times the amount you lent me back then." Yes, that was very helpful. I bought myself a small cottage not far from the city and a car. I had no time to do the housework, so I hired a helper. She was almost 15 years younger than me. She was quite a young woman who had already been married. She had lived with her ex-husband for almost 20 years. They had no children due to her infertility, and her husband eventually left her for someone else. A neighbor told me all this. The employee herself did not talk about it much. I had no plans with her. She was nothing more than an assistant. Almost half a year passed like that. One day, I was chopping wood and I felt sick. I had a terrible headache, and I fainted and woke up in the hospital. She was sitting next to my bed. She was the one who called the ambulance when the doctors arrived. She sat holding my head in her lap. I was fine. Cranial brain injuries just don't go away that easily. After that incident, I began to look at her with different eyes, and only now I realized what a beautiful woman she was. Somehow our relationship naturally evolved into intimacy. At one point I asked her to marry me. We got married in the fall. I knew we couldn't have children, so I felt free to make love to her. About 3 months after the wedding, she started feeling bad, vomiting, headaches. I immediately took her to my clinic. Imagine my surprise when I found out that she had been pregnant for almost 2 months. That's when I realized one truth. If fate closes one door in front of us, it immediately opens another. Anyway, life was getting better. And then one day, just before New Year's, my ex-wife called me. "We need to meet," she said in a pitifully pleading voice. I made a reservation at a restaurant. She sat across from me, her whole expression of humility and remorse. "Forgive me, there hasn't been a day that I haven't thought of you." Her eyes began to fill with tears. "I made a terrible mistake. I betrayed you, our family, our children." She kept talking, and I stared silently at my once madly beloved woman. The woman I would not hesitate to give my life for. The woman who, without hesitation, had twice cynically betrayed me. The woman who lied to me for 20 years. The woman who cut me out of her life and left me for another man. And now she has suddenly come to her senses and is trying to get back with me. My ex kept saying that her time without me had made her realize how much she loved me, that she understood only now that I was the only real man in her life. I looked at her brightly painted lipstick and the mouth that awaited my ears with such sweet words and imagined her kissing and caressing her lover with it. Did she really think I would believe her words, that she was confused, that she didn't know what she wanted? That this woman who cheated on me, had a child with her lover, left me and spent her free time with another man, and never thought of me. She came back because, it turns out, she only loved me. In her own time, she found an excuse for her meanness and did not hesitate to leave me. She had had her fill of sensual pleasures with her lover, having been in his bed more than once, and she had coldly planned the moment to give me one last fatal blow. And now she was here to offer me the only precious thing she had left, but had already taken advantage of her lover. She realized he only wanted her for fun, and as long as she had the money. When she realized this, she came to me, hoping to try to get back what she had lost. God, do I seem so stupid to her, ready to believe all her lies? I listened in silence to her remorse-filled monologue. I had nothing to say to her, you know. I didn't revel in her humiliation or gloat. I even felt kind of human for her. It's a shame, after all, 40 years together. But it was time for our meeting to end. And at that moment my phone rang. My girlfriend called me and asked where to come and get me. As I came out of the restaurant, I turned around. My ex-girlfriend was standing with her hands pressed to her chest, looking at me through the festively decorated shop window. Around me, people were bustling and hurrying somewhere. Life went on. I got in my car and turned the ignition key. The engine was sticking out smoothly and serenely. I turned left and a few seconds later joined the stream of cars which were always rushing around. So that's the story. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new stories.